Take a look at your driver's license.
There is a good chance that right there on the front there is a small red heart.
Or the word donor printed in bold letters.
Exactly. You probably checked that box at the DMV without a second thought. I mean, viewing it as a simple, ultimate act of charity.
A pure altruistic gift.
Right. A gift to someone in desperate need. But today, we are asking a central, necessary question. What is the actual truth about the organ donation system in the United States?
What does the public fundamentally misunderstand about that little red heart?
Yeah, because the reality is much more complex.
To answer that, we are pulling from a massive stack of source material. We are looking at recent congressional investigations, federal audits from the Department of Health and Human Services, internal billing data, and the Transplant Network's own operational metrics. And we need to establish a core reality up front for you, the listener.
Yes.
Organ donation does save lives. It absolutely does. But the public assumes this process is a neutral, nonprofit exchange, and the evidence reveals something entirely different.
The data shows that organ donation operates as a multi-billion-dollar, highly regulated corporate ecosystem.
Right, and our investigative focus today is on that exact ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
We are looking at a medical structure with distinct profit centers, aggressive procurement targets, and executive bonuses baked into almost every step of the process.
Which is vital to understand.
We need to be absolutely clear right at the start, though. Human organs are not sold.
Yeah.
That is a federal crime. But every single service, evaluation, transportation, and surgical procedure surrounding those organs is heavily monetized.
To understand how a free, altruistic gift fuels a multi-billion-dollar industry, we really have to look at the foundational architecture.
The framework.
Right. The framework is managed at the federal level. You have the national rulemakers, known as the OPTN, who determine the algorithms for who gets an organ and when.
Okay.
For decades, the day-to-day operation of that network was contracted to a single private entity called UNOS.
Right, UNOS. And UNOS is a name that frequently appears in these congressional hearings we reviewed.
Yes, and while not in a positive light, Congress actually recently moved to break up their monopoly.
Because of the mismanagement.
Exactly. The federal investigations highlighted severe mismanagement, catastrophic IT failures, lost organs, and a pervasive lack of transparency. So federal regulators are now forcing modernization.
But the actual ground-level work, the physical acquisition of the organs, isn't done by those federal agencies.
No, it's not. It is done by regional acquisition teams, known as Organ Procurement Organizations, or OPOs.
OPOs. There are 56 of these regional OPOs operating across the United States, right?
That's correct. And they each hold an exclusive geographic territory. They're the ones who actually go into the hospitals. And then finally, you have the transplant centers.
Hospitals themselves.
Yes, the massive hospital systems that actually perform the surgeries.
So, Tessa, let's walk through the timeline of a donor case so we can clearly see how these entities interact inside the hospital room.
Okay.
The chain of events always begins with a catastrophic medical event.
Yeah.
A severe stroke, a car accident, a massive cardiac arrest.
The patient is admitted to an intensive care unit.
Right. And the hospital's trauma and neurology teams attempt all indicated life-saving treatments.
But if those treatments fail and the patient's condition deteriorates to meet very specific clinical triggers, like a loss of brainstem reflexes, the hospital is legally required to make an imminent death referral.
And this is a crucial point for you to understand. They have to call the regional OPO before the family even knows that death is imminent.
That is correct. It is a mandatory federal regulation. At that point, the OPO begins evaluating the patient remotely. If the patient is deemed a potential candidate, one of two clinical pathways occurs. Either the patient is officially declared brain dead by the attending physicians, or the family makes the agonizing end-of-life decision to withdraw life support.
Which is the DC pathway, right?
Yes, donation after circulatory death. Once either of those determinations is made, the family is approached by the OPO staff for authorization.
Now, I was floored by the actual dollar amounts documented in these hospital billing audits. I mean, we think of the word nonprofit and we naturally assume no money is involved.
It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the corporate structure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because looking at the financial data, a single organ transplant is a massive financial event for a medical center.
Right. Nonprofit status simply dictates how revenue is taxed and distributed at the end of the year. It does not limit how much revenue is generated, what the hospitals charge, or, frankly, how executives are compensated.
I think the best way to visualize this financial structure is to think about a rare, priceless engine block. Let's say I give you this incredibly complex engine for absolutely free. The core component costs you nothing.
Right.
But you still have to pay the specialized mechanics who come to retrieve it. You have to pay the private transport team who flies it across the country.
And the garage?
Exactly. You have to pay the high-end garage that evaluates and eventually installs it. By the time that free engine is running in your car, millions of dollars have changed hands.
That perfectly mirrors the economic flow of a transplant. Federal law strictly prohibits buying or selling the human heart, liver, or kidney.
It is good.
Yes. But the OPOs charge heavy acquisition fees, often called standard acquisition charges, to the transplant centers just to deliver the organ.
Just for delivery.
Right. Those transplant centers then bundle that fee into their own massive invoices. They bill Medicare or private insurance providers for the initial evaluations, the transplant surgical procedures, the weeks of intensive care recovery, and the lifelong follow-up care.
Walk me through those numbers, Tessa. What does the data actually show a hospital generating per transplant?
Transplants are among the most highly profitable medical episodes for any hospital system. According to the billing data, a single kidney transplant generates between $250,000 and $400,000 in top-line revenue.
A single kidney.
Yes. A liver transplant generates $500,000 to $800,000. And heart and lung transplants are massive undertakings, frequently exceeding $1 million to $1.3 million per episode.
And the money doesn't stop at the hospital doors. I mean, pharmaceutical companies generate continuous, locked-in revenue from the lifelong immunosuppressant drugs that the recipient must take every single day.
Every day, just to keep their body from rejecting the organ. Precisely.
It's an economy of its own.
And this wealth generation extends to the executives running the 56 regional OPOs. Even though these are technically nonprofit organizations, the chief executives are compensated at levels reflecting a major corporate enterprise.
What are we talking about here?
OPO chief executives frequently earn base salaries between $500,000 and well over $1 million annually.
Over $1 million.
Yes. And in several audited cases, these executives receive specific performance bonuses that are directly tied to the volume of organs their teams recover.
Tessa, this is where we need to transition into the dark dive.
I agree.
We have established the money. Now we need to examine how those financial and regulatory incentives fundamentally alter the behavior of the people inside this system.
To understand the behavior, Ryan, we have to look at the pressure cooker these OPOs operate within. The federal government, specifically the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, evaluates every single OPO using strict performance metrics.
CMS.
Yes, CMS. They grade them on how many potential donors they identify in their territory and how many organs they successfully recover. Based on those numbers, CMS ranks every OPO into Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3.
And falling into that bottom tier is essentially a death sentence for the organization.
It is. If an OPO falls to Tier 3, they risk losing their federal certification. That means they lose their exclusive geographic territory, their revenue stream, and their entire operation is shut down or taken over by a competing OPO.
It introduces ruthless corporate competition into a system the public views as purely cooperative.
Exactly. These OPOs are essentially fighting for donor share. It builds a high-intensity, high-turnover internal culture focused aggressively on case volume and metric impact.
Because their jobs are on the line.
Right. The staff on the ground are constantly aware that failing to meet these national recovery benchmarks could cost them their jobs and shut their organization down.
Now, we need to pause here and be incredibly precise about what the evidence actually says. When people hear about financial incentives and recovery quotas, public myth and fear easily take over.
Yes, they do.
We must separate verified facts from internet rumors. Doctors do not let patients die to harvest their organs.
They do not.
The ICU physicians treating the catastrophic injury are completely separate from the transplant teams. The doctors trying to save your life have nothing to do with the OPO.
That's right.
Furthermore, hospitals do not sell organs on the black market, and registered donors do not receive a lower standard of medical care.
Those myths are completely unsupported by the evidence. The system's failures are structural, not malicious conspiracies by bedside doctors.
Right.
But the verified institutional realities we found in the sources are just as critical to understand. Because of that intense pressure to hit recovery quotas to stay out of Tier 3 OPO staff are fundamentally trained using modern sales psychology.
Explain how that actually sounds inside the hospital waiting room. I mean, how does that pressure manifest when a family is approached?
Internally, many OPOs employ what they call family authorization specialists. These are not grief counselors. Their metric of success is the authorization rate.
Okay.
The training materials show that they use highly structured communication techniques. For example, they are trained never to ask a yes or no question like, do you want to donate your loved one's organs?
Because the family might just say no.
Exactly. Instead, they use the presumptive close. They say, we are here to fulfill your loved one's legacy of giving.
It is an orchestrated emotional framing.
It is. They are trained in objection handling. If a family expresses hesitation about the timeline or the surgery, the specialist has a scripted pivot ready to recenter the conversation on heroism and legacy. They also utilize precise timing strategies. They separate the moment the doctor delivers the death notification from the moment the OPO approaches the family, waiting for the initial shock to pass before presenting the paperwork.
So it's very calculated.
To the OPO, this is simply consent optimization. But the techniques closely mirror high-end professional sales training, all deployed in the darkest hour of a family's life.
And having established that intense pressure to secure the authorization, we need to look at what happens next, the physical reality of recovering those organs.
Yes.
This brings us to one of the most striking and frankly alarming documented realities in the federal audits. Tessa, break down the licensing standards for the personnel who physically handle the organs in the operating room.
The individuals responsible for physically handling, recovering, packaging, and preserving these organs are not required to hold medical licenses.
Wait, I want to make sure the listener fully absorbs that. The people responsible for the delicate surgical preservation of a human kidney or a liver or a heart do not need a medical license.
That is the documented regulatory reality. Federal rules govern OPO staffing, not state medical boards. OPOs are legally allowed to hire unlicensed staff for critical roles like organ recovery technicians and preservation specialists.
That's unbelievable.
They frequently hire individuals with absolutely no prior medical background, put them through an internal training program, and deploy them directly into trauma center operating rooms.
But how exactly does an unlicensed technician cause damage? What are they physically doing in the operating room that puts the organs at risk?
Well, it comes down to the mechanics of organ preservation. Once the primary transplant surgeons remove the heart or lungs, the abdominal organs like the kidneys are often left to the local OPO recovery team to manage. To preserve an organ, you have to flush the blood out of the vascular system and replace it with a specialized ice-cold preservation fluid. This requires inserting a catheter into the major arteries, a process called cannulation.
And if you don't know human anatomy well enough.
Exactly. If an inexperienced technician uses the wrong pressure while flushing the fluid, they can blow out the microscopic capillaries inside the kidney.
Which ruins it.
Right. If they nick the renal artery during packaging, the organ cannot be surgically attached to the recipient. If they use too much ice, they can literally freeze the tissue, causing irreversible cellular damage.
And this is documented.
Very clearly. The oversight bodies have thoroughly documented that inadequate training directly leads to packaging errors, incorrect preservation techniques, and destroyed organs.
So why does the system allow it? I mean, if these organs are so precious, why are we trusting them to unlicensed staff?
It is driven entirely by the systemic pressures we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Licensed clinicians like registered nurses or certified surgical techs are expensive to hire.
Right.
Furthermore, the internal culture of an OPO is grueling. It involves 24-hour on-call shifts, constant overnight travel, and a massive emotional burden. Burnout is incredibly high, and staffing churn is constant.
So it's a labor cost issue.
Yes. Hiring unlicensed staff allows OPOs to keep labor costs down and rapidly replace personnel so they can keep chasing those federal recovery metrics.
Which leads us directly to the consequence of that chase, the issue of discarded organs.
The federal audits confirm that thousands of recovered organs are thrown away every single year. The numbers are staggering. In some analyses, nearly 1/3 of all recovered kidneys in the United States are ultimately discarded.
1/3?
They never make it into a patient.
I have to ask the critical structural question here. If these regional OPOs are evaluated, ranked, and financially rewarded based on the raw number of organs they physically pull out of a body, does the system inherently ignore whether those organs are actually viable enough to be transplanted?
The data indicates exactly that, Ryan. The systemic misalignment is profound. The federal metrics reward the OPO for the act of recovery. Getting the organ out of the donor counts as a win on their internal dashboards.
But what about the actual transplant?
The metric does not adequately track ultimate transplant success. This creates a structural pressure for the OPO to recover marginal borderline organs from older or sicker donors just to meet their quota and stay out of Tier 3.
And then what happens? They package it up, send it to a hospital.
And the transplant surgeons at the hospital look at the organ, look at the biopsy results, and decline it. They deem it too risky for their patient.
So the organ sits on ice.
Exactly. The OPO frantically tries to call other hospitals down the wait list, but the clock is ticking. Cold ischemic time is accumulating. Eventually, the organ degrades to the point where it is no longer viable, and it is thrown in the biomedical waste bin.
So the waste isn't necessarily a malicious act.
No, it is not malicious. It is the result of operational failure. It reflects logistical delays, inexperienced OPO staff struggling with transportation, and risk-averse behavior from transplant centers who decline organs due to incomplete medical information.
But the end result is the same.
Thousands of donated organs, given in good faith, go to waste.
And all of this happens behind a curtain. The families making these decisions are operating with massive blind spots regarding the clinical reality they are consenting to.
The families are dealing with a severe information deficit. For instance, they are not told that OPOs have legal access to the patient's medical records before the family is even approached.
Wow.
OPO staff are often physically present in the hospital, reviewing charts, running internal suitability scores, and strategizing their approach, while the family is still praying for a miracle recovery.
The families are also rarely given the full, nuanced context of brain death.
Brain death is a very real clinical state, but it is a legal definition, not a universal, immutable medical consensus. The specific testing criteria, the apnea tests, the neurological exams vary state by state and sometimes hospital by hospital.
Right.
The family is simply told that the patient has passed without understanding the variability in how that threshold was legally met.
But perhaps the most jarring blind spot for these families is the physical reality of what happens after they sign the paperwork.
Yes. Families naturally expect that once authorization is given, there will be a quiet, peaceful cessation.
Right.
They do not realize that the donor must be managed like a living critical care patient for days.
Gaze.
Yes. To preserve the organ quality, the body remains on a ventilator.
Yeah.
Heavy medications are adjusted hourly to maintain blood pressure, paralytics are administered, rigorous lab work and continuous monitoring occur.
It's an intensive process.
It is highly technical, continuous critical care performed on a legally dead body, solely to protect the assets inside.
It is difficult to overstate the profound emotional weight placed on these donor families. I mean, you are looking at mothers, fathers, spouses making an agonizing decision in their darkest possible hour.
It's heartbreaking.
They agree to donation, believing they are participating in a quiet, purely altruistic act of giving. They are completely unaware of the highly optimized, profit-driven machinery operating all around them.
Right.
The performance dashboards in the OPO headquarters, the group texts tracking the recovery metrics, the rapid escalation protocols, the executive bonuses tied to the organs of their loved one.
There is an immense gap between the public's belief in the transplant system and the documented reality. The public believes in a flawless, sacred transfer of life.
Yes.
But the federal investigations uncover a system plagued by lost organs, systemic transportation delays, unlicensed technicians, high executive payouts, and thousands of discarded donations.
As Congress finally begins to break up the UNOS monopoly and demand modernization of the IT systems, a much deeper structural question remains. It isn't just about which contractor manages the waitlist algorithms.
No, it's not.
You have to look at the underlying biology and the money attached to it. As long as a human organ generates hundreds of thousands of dollars of economic activity for the hospitals, the transport teams, and the pharmaceutical companies, we have to ask if a system fundamentally built on financial incentives can ever truly align with the selfless intent of the donors it relies on.
That is the ultimate question.
Or has the very act of saving a life become permanently commodified?
The system requires extreme, unquestioning altruism from the public, but operates internally on aggressive corporate survival metrics. Until that fundamental misalignment is resolved, the loss of viable organs and the breach of public trust will likely continue.
We want to hear from you. If you have insights, questions, or theories, reach out. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.
And if you want to hear more episodes of The Dark Dive, consider following and subscribing. It helps us continue bringing these stories to light.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Dark Dive.